I was scraping old wax from a frame I had no hive left urgent enough to need it for, an old habit from over 30 years of beekeeping, when my son called to tell me I wouldn't be needed at the Regional Beekeeping Association's memorial recognition, honoring the gentle beeline my husband had spent his entire career developing. I remember setting the hive tool down slowly, a fleck of old propolis still stuck to my thumb, right before his explanation rearranged the entire shape of that phone call. I had no idea that within the same conversation, I would also learn that my daughter-in-law's growing skincare brand described discovering this uniquely gentle bee temperament entirely on her own, with no mention of the man who had actually spent decades selectively breeding for it, and that within the following week, I would send a single formal letter through my attorney, revoking a licensing agreement I had signed 2 years earlier, one that would pull our entire heritage bee stock out of her hands permanently. My name is Hazel Winslow. I'm 74 years old. I spent over 35 years keeping bees alongside my husband, the kind of work that teaches you patience most people never develop, and teaches you, too, that a temperament bred carefully over decades cannot simply be claimed as someone else's lucky discovery without becoming something else entirely. My husband Gideon died 4 years ago, a sudden and severe allergic reaction to a sting, the first serious one he'd ever had in over 3 decades of working these same gentle hives without incident. I remember him calling out from the apiary, his voice already strange, and running to him across the field, arriving only moments too late for the epinephrine to do what it needed to do. Grief that arrives in the middle of the very work someone spent their life loving teaches you something particular. It teaches you that the low hum of a hive can undo you completely for years afterward, and that you learn, slowly, to keep tending them anyway, because the alternative is letting the silence claim every careful season he ever built. Gideon and I built our life together slowly, the unglamorous way most honest things get built. He worked as an agricultural extension agent for the county for nearly 30 years, patient with every farmer who called him out for a problem that turned out to be something else entirely, the kind of man who never once made anyone feel foolish for asking. When I told him 4 years into our marriage that I wanted to take beekeeping beyond a small backyard hobby into something more serious, he didn't tell me it would be difficult with 2 small children at home. He told me he'd handle every school pickup and every dinner on my longest evenings at the apiary, and he did for years without complaint. I built my own knowledge slowly after that, the way most honest expertise gets built, one carefully observed season at a time, over 35 years among the hives, until I finally slowed down considerably with more patience than I sometimes believed I had any right to feel. I remember one particular young beekeeper early in my own years with the regional association, a woman convinced she'd never develop a proper feel for reading a hive's mood, whom I spent an entire season quietly mentoring after our shared inspections, never once mentioning to the association's board how much extra time it actually required. She went on to manage her own small apiary for over a decade, and years later a letter arrived thanking me for refusing to let her give up on her own instincts. I think about that letter often now, in a different light than I once did, understanding that quiet, uncredited mentorship had always been the actual substance of my working life long before anyone in my own family learned to take my own judgment for granted. Gideon didn't live to see the beeline reach its current commercial success. He died 4 years before Aldrich ever brought Coraline's plans for a skincare brand to me, and some mornings I still catch myself wanting to show him a particularly promising new queen before remembering there's no one on the other end of that particular conversation anymore. I have 2 children. Rosalie, my daughter, is a high school biology teacher, 3 time zones away, patient and exacting in exactly the way you'd hope a science teacher's mind would be. She calls every Sunday evening without fail, a habit that started the year Gideon died and never once lapsed since. Aldrich, my son, is 40, works in agricultural equipment sales, married for 4 years to a woman named Coraline Beaumont, 32, whose growing skincare and honey products business he has supported personally since they met, and who has always had a particular gift for making an inherited breeding line sound like her own personal discovery. Coraline grew up in a family that valued the appearance of natural talent above almost everything else, the kind of household where admitting you'd built something slowly through inherited knowledge and patient decades was treated as a quiet confession of unoriginality. I don't say that to excuse what eventually happened. I say it because understanding where someone's hunger for soul discovery comes from doesn't mean you're obligated to keep feeding that hunger forever, especially once feeding it starts costing you your own husband's life's work. She told me a story once early in her relationship with Aldrich, back when we still spoke easily and often, about her own mother's small landscaping business, how she used to describe every established, mature garden she took over maintaining as her own original design, never once acknowledging the previous owner's decades of planning. My mom always said clients paid for a vision, not a history lesson, she told me. I grew up believing that claiming full authorship, regardless of what actually came before you, was simply how you built a convincing brand. I remember thinking at the time that it was a sad philosophy, worthy of real compassion. I didn't yet understand that she had absorbed an entire framework built around a racing inherited context, and that I would eventually become the inconvenient actual history that particular framework required minimizing. Gideon and I spent over 3 decades developing our particular beeline together, starting with a single, unusually calm colony he'd noticed during a routine inspection early in our marriage, patiently selecting and breeding queens from that same gentle temperament generation after generation until we'd stabilized a strain remarkably calm for handling, resistant to several common diseases, and producing a distinctively mild, floral honey that regional chefs and honey enthusiasts specifically sought out. It found modest, genuine recognition over the years, several ribbons at regional agricultural fairs, a small but respected reputation among serious beekeepers who understood exactly what that level of patient selective breeding actually required. After Gideon died, that beeline became something closer to sacred to me, the clearest remaining trace of decades of patient devotion, since I had spent nearly every one of those seasons working the hives alongside him, learning to read exactly what he was watching for in each new generation's temperament. When Aldrich came to me 2 years ago, describing Coraline's plans to build a boutique skincare and honey products line specifically around our own hive's gentle, distinctive character, I was genuinely moved, thrilled to think of Gideon's decades of careful breeding finally reaching a wider audience of people who could actually appreciate what had gone into it. I did insist, however, on a proper licensing agreement, drafted formally with my attorney rather than simply handed over on a handshake between mother-in-law and daughter-in-law. Coraline would receive rights to use our specific bee stock and the Winslow apiary name in her products and marketing, along with a standard royalty in exchange for accurately crediting Gideon's actual decades of breeding work in all promotional materials and public statements. At the time, that condition felt like nothing more than sensible protection for a lifetime of patient work. It would take 2 years of careful, creeping erasure before I understood exactly what that condition was actually protecting. Before signing anything, I met with my attorney, a sharp, longtime family friend named Prudence Okafor, who had helped Gideon and me handle several land and equipment matters over the decades. Licensing a breeding line you developed yourself is trickier than people assume, she told me. The line's story has real value independent of the honey itself, and that value depends entirely on the narrative people believe about where that gentleness actually came from. Protect the story as carefully as you protect the hives. I thanked her and left her office determined to follow that advice completely. Coraline signed the agreement herself at Prudence's small conference table, reading every page carefully before asking, almost shyly, if she could suit up and walk the apiary with me one more time before committing to anything. I spent that entire afternoon with her among the hives, showing her exactly which colonies descended from that very first calm queen decades earlier. I want you to actually understand what this protects, I told her. Not just the honey, the whole story behind it. She promised she understood completely, and I believed her, having no reason at the time to imagine that promise wouldn't eventually be tested by her own growing business ambitions. I remember Coraline's very first product launch event vividly, standing near the display watching longtime customers who remembered buying honey from Gideon and me for years, genuinely moved by how naturally the brand seemed to fit our own family's history, several of them thanking me warmly before they'd even properly greeted Coraline herself. Coraline's skincare business launched 2 years ago to genuine early success. Our own particular Beeline's mild, distinctive honey serving as the centerpiece ingredient in nearly every product she developed. For the first several months, everything felt like exactly what I'd hoped it would be. Gideon's name properly credited in her own early materials, Coraline speaking warmly about the honor of working with such a genuinely remarkable beeline. The first time I noticed the story beginning to shift was during a regional artisan business magazine profile 9 months in, a glossy piece with professional photography of the hives themselves, when Coraline described discovering this uniquely gentle bee temperament almost by accident, framing her own early hive visits as a personal revelation rather than acknowledging that Gideon had spent over 30 years deliberately breeding for that exact quality, decades before Coraline ever entered the family. I read that article twice at my own kitchen table, searching for even a passing acknowledgement of Gideon's actual patient labor, and found none. The second incident happened at a small farmers market gathering when a genuinely curious customer, meeting me for the first time, complimented the honey's remarkably mild flavor, asking Coraline how she'd managed to find bees this gentle to work with. Coraline answered before I could clarify anything, describing months of her own careful observation and handling technique, as though the actual decades of selective breeding had been her own recent accomplishment rather than Gideon's lifetime project. I corrected the record gently that time, mentioning simply that my late husband had bred that exact temperament himself over more than 30 years. Coraline laughed it off smoothly, telling the customer that I was being modest on her behalf, and the conversation moved on before I could clarify further. The third incident happened on Coraline's own social media account, a beautifully produced video of her working calmly among the hives without protective gear, the caption describing her personal journey, discovering an almost impossibly gentle bee temperament, and building her entire skincare brand around that discovery. My name and Gideon's appeared nowhere in that caption, nor did any mention of the beeline's actual 30-year breeding history. The post received thousands of admiring comments about Coraline's natural connection with the bees. I read those comments more than once, searching for even a passing acknowledgement, and found none. The fourth incident happened when Coraline began describing the beeline in interviews for regional wellness publications as a strain she and Aldrich had personally cultivated through careful modern breeding techniques, drawing loosely on the apiary's history rather than acknowledging over 3 decades of documented pairing decisions that predated her entirely. I mentioned to Aldrich gently that I found the growing distance from the beeline's actual origin increasingly uncomfortable. He told me Coraline simply had a flair for describing her brand's creative story, and that surely it didn't really matter exactly how she framed a detail that small. The fifth incident happened during a planning conversation for the Beekeeping Association's upcoming memorial recognition, honoring regional breeders who had made significant contributions to the craft. Sitting around Aldrich and Coraline's kitchen table with a nomination form spread between us when Coraline mentioned, almost as an aside, that she thought it might be cleaner for the recognition's own narrative if the framing focused entirely on her own discovery journey with the bees rather than getting into the licensing agreement specifics, since the association responded better to a clean personal story. "Hazel, you understand right," she said, glancing at me with a practiced, reasonable smile. "It's not about hiding anything. It's just easier at this point." I sat there listening to my daughter-in-law discuss minimizing my documented breeding rights as a matter of ceremony strategy, as though over 3 decades of Gideon's and my own patient work were an inconvenient footnote rather than the very foundation her entire business depended on. The sixth incident happened when Coraline's own mother, meeting me for the first time at a holiday gathering, mentioned how proud she was watching her daughter build something so impressive entirely through her own natural gift with animals. She's always had that gift, she said, beaming, for finding something ordinary and turning it into something extraordinary. I said nothing to correct her, the same way I'd said nothing to correct anyone else. Though I remember driving home afterward feeling the particular loneliness of being the only person in an entire extended family who actually knew the truth of a story everyone else believed completely. The seventh incident is the one I think about most because it's the one where I should have said something and didn't. It happened when Coraline's business was featured at a significant regional harvest festival, and the festival's own promotional materials described the bees entirely as a rare, naturally gentle strain Coraline had personally discovered and cultivated, with no mention of the apiary's actual 35-year breeding history at all. I saw the printed festival program weeks later, my husband's entire life's work reduced to a single generic phrase, a remarkably gentle bee strain cultivated by a passionate young entrepreneur. The eighth incident happened at a small regional wellness industry award dinner where Coraline's brand was nominated for a Rising Entrepreneur recognition, specifically citing her use of these remarkably gentle bees. She accepted the smaller award that evening, giving brief remarks about the incredible journey of discovering this temperament entirely through her own patient observation, gesturing at projected images of the hives as though decades of careful selective breeding had simply been a lucky accident she'd stumbled into. I applauded along with everyone else, understanding, with a clarity that had been building for 2 years by that point, exactly how completely the record had been rewritten, and exactly how comfortable everyone around me had become with that rewritten version. I didn't understand yet that splinters left alone don't disappear. They work their way deeper. I want to tell you that I confronted this early, that I was the kind of woman who draws a firm line the moment she's disrespected. I wasn't. I told myself 100 different stories to avoid dealing with the truth. Coraline is just building her own brand the way entrepreneurs do. Aldrich loves me even if he doesn't correct her in the moment. The bees are finally getting the recognition Gideon always hoped they would, and that should be enough. I believed every one of those stories, some days more than others, because believing them was easier than accepting that my husband's decades of patient breeding had become an inconvenient detail in someone else's more compelling discovery story. There was one afternoon, about 2 months before everything finally came to a head, when I came close to saying something. Coraline called to ask whether I'd be comfortable if a magazine profile simply described the bees as a family heritage strain without getting into specifics about who actually bred them, since she felt the vaguer phrasing made for a cleaner narrative arc in the piece. I sat with the phone in my hand afterward, feeling something rise up in me that felt very close to the surface, very close to finally saying out loud everything I'd swallowed for nearly 2 years. Then I thought about Aldrich's happiness, about how much this business had already come to mean to him, about how a fight over credit would only ever complicate something he loved. I agreed to the vague phrasing and told myself one more time that the moment to say something hadn't quite arrived yet. Looking back, I understand now that I was wrong about that. The moment had arrived long before. I simply hadn't been ready to stand inside it yet. Then came the call about the memorial recognition. Aldrich called on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, his voice carrying a practiced carefulness I recognized immediately, the tone he used whenever he was delivering a message that wasn't entirely his own idea. "Mom," he said, "I wanted to give you a heads up about the Beekeeping Association's memorial ceremony next month. Coraline and I think it might be simpler if it's just her accepting the recognition on the apiary's behalf. It's a huge platform for the brand, and we want the moment to feel focused." I set down the scraper slowly, still resting against the old frame. "Aldrich," I said carefully, "your father spent over 30 years developing that beeline before Coraline ever put on a veil. What exactly does focused mean in this context?" "It's not about excluding you," he said. "We just want her recognition to feel uncomplicated for this particular ceremony." "I see," I said. "And has the association's own program even mentioned your father's name or the beeline's actual history at all? Or is that also part of what needs to feel uncomplicated?" There was a brief pause. "It's mostly focused on Caroline's contribution to the industry right now. We can address the history stuff separately if it comes up." And you don't think over 30 years of your father's own breeding work is relevant information for a ceremony honoring exactly this kind of contribution? He didn't have a ready answer for that. I didn't argue with him further in that moment. I told him I understood, thanked him for the heads up, and hung up the phone. I sat at my own kitchen table for a long time afterward, understanding with a clarity that arrived all at once exactly what I was going to do, though I decided to wait to see how the Harvest Festival 3 weeks later unfolded before making any final decision. The festival was held at the regional fairground, rows of vendor tents arranged under a bright autumn sky, hundreds of attendees, including fellow beekeepers, wellness industry buyers, and festival organizers who'd come specifically to see the season's featured products. I arrived early, helping arrange Coraline's own display table out of habit as much as love, the same instinct I'd brought to nearly every one of our own market appearances over 3 decades. For the first hour, the afternoon was in fact lovely. I spoke with several longtime beekeepers who remembered Gideon fondly, genuinely curious about the line's continued development, and with one of the festival organizers, a careful woman named Priscilla Okonkwo, who asked almost as an aside how the bee line had actually come to Coraline's attention. I answered honestly, mentioning the direct family connection in plain, factual terms, and watched Coraline's attention flicker toward us from across the display area without quite approaching. For a little while, I let myself believe the whole afternoon might simply pass without incident. That evening, at the festival's own awards ceremony, Coraline accepted an innovation award for her skincare line, giving warm remarks to the assembled crowd about the incredible journey of discovering this remarkably gentle bee temperament entirely on her own. One careful observation at a time, she gestured toward projected images of the hives throughout, never once mentioning their actual 35-year breeding history, their true origin, or the man whose decades of careful selection had made any of tonight's recognition possible at all. The crowd applauded warmly. I sat near the back of the tent, listening to my husband's entire life's work reduced to a footnote in someone else's discovery story. I stood up slowly from my seat. The tent quieted the way a room quiets when it senses something is about to happen that it hasn't fully decided how to feel about yet. Since we're celebrating a discovery tonight, I said, my voice calmer than I expected it to be, I'd like to add something to that story, since it seems to have gone missing somewhere along the way. My husband Gideon spent over 30 years breeding that exact gentleness into our hives, one careful generation at a time, long before either of tonight's speakers ever put on a veil. I paused, letting that land fully before continuing. To those hives, I said, that's about to go back to being represented by the people who actually bred them. The silence that followed was the kind you could have poured into a glass and served alongside the dinner wine. Aldrich's face went through several expressions in rapid succession, confusion first, then something closer to dawning understanding. Coraline's smile didn't fall so much as it simply stopped existing, replaced by something rigid and pale. Hazel, she said quietly, what are you talking about? Near the edge of the tent, I saw Priscilla Okonkwo quietly set down her own glass, her expression carrying the particular stillness of someone doing rapid calculations about an award she was reconsidering in real time. I didn't answer the confused murmurs that followed. I set my glass down gently on the nearest table, walked to Aldrich first, kissed his cheek, told him I loved him and that nothing about tonight changed that, and then I picked up my coat and walked toward the exit, past the vendor tents, past the very hives I'd spent decades tending, past hundreds of faces that had gone very quiet, very fast. I drove home with the windows down, the cool evening air moving through the car, and I felt something I hadn't expected to feel. Not rage, something quieter and colder than that, a clarity. Somewhere along that dark road, I thought about every early morning Gideon and I had spent together at those hives, decades before either of us imagined his own life's work would end up credited as someone else's lucky discovery. I thought, too, about the years after Gideon died, learning to manage every part of the apiary alone, the equipment repairs, the disease monitoring, the small decisions he'd once handled without complaint. Widowhood had taught me, whether I wanted the lesson or not, that I was considerably more capable than anyone, including myself at times, had given me credit for. I felt that old, hard-won capability rising back up in me now, and I understood, with total clarity, exactly what I was going to do before I even reached my own driveway. I called my old friend Marguerite before I called anyone else, a woman I'd kept bees alongside for over 2 decades in the same regional beekeeping association, needing to hear a voice that understood the craft as deeply as I did. I told her the whole story, 2 years of incidents, the toast, the walk out the tent. She listened without interrupting, her own tea going cold in front of her. "Hazel," she finally said, "you taught every new beekeeper who ever joined our association that a breeding line carries a responsibility to honor the hands that actually developed it. I don't think that principle stops applying just because the entrepreneur in question happens to be family. I keep waiting to feel guilty about what I'm about to do," I told her, "and it isn't coming." "Maybe it isn't coming," Marguerite said, "because there's nothing here to feel guilty about. You didn't abandon your family. You stopped subsidizing your own husband's erasure from a line he actually built. Those are very different things, no matter how anyone else wants to frame it." I called Rosalie that same evening as well, needing to hear a voice that would tell me the truth rather than simply agree with me. I told her the whole story, 2 years of incidents leading up to it, the toast, my own response. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Mom," she finally said, "you've been letting yourself get smaller for 2 years so Coraline can feel bigger about a discovery she didn't make. That's not generosity anymore. That's just a slow kind of disappearing." I know," I said. "I think I've known it for a while." "So what happens next? Are you actually going to revoke the license, or is this still just something you're considering?" "I already know exactly what I'm going to do," I told her. "I just needed to talk it through with someone first." That same evening, I called my attorney, Prudence Okafor, who had drafted the original licensing agreement and understood exactly what protection I'd built into it 2 years earlier. I explained the pattern plainly: 2 years of quiet erasure, the toast, the deliberate exclusion from the memorial recognition. "Let me pull up the actual document while we talk, Hazel," she said. "The termination language is specific here. Repeated public misrepresentation of the beeline's origin and breeding credit, sufficient grounds to terminate with the standard notice period. That condition has clearly been met tonight in front of hundreds of witnesses, which makes this about as clean a termination case as I've seen in years of drafting these agreements." I sat with that fact for a long moment, understanding finally exactly why I'd insisted on that condition in the first place. Those first few days after the festival were harder than I expected. I found myself, more than once, reaching for the phone to call Prudence and tell her to hold off. That surely there was some gentler way to make my point without actually revoking Coraline's rights. I stood among the hives one entire evening, walking the length of the rows all the way to the original colony's descendants, still humming quietly in the late autumn light, trying to remind myself exactly what I was protecting before I let the decision go any further. Each time, I made myself sit with the discomfort a little longer instead of acting on it, remembering Marguerite's words, remembering the actual weight of the phrase, a discovery entirely on her own, remembering that gentler corrections had already had 2 years to work and hadn't. I want to be clear about what I did and did not do because I think it matters. I did not simply demand full control back out of spite. Prudence drafted a formal, professional letter revoking the license, citing the specific documented misrepresentations by date, the magazine profile, the farmers market gathering, the social media caption, the festival program. Each one referenced plainly and specifying the standard 60-day window for Coraline to source alternative bee stock for her products. I sent that letter through her office with no personal note attached beyond what the letter itself required. The same plain, unremarkable language that could have applied to any licensing dispute between any two parties anywhere in the industry. Aldrich called the following morning, his voice tight with panic rather than his usual warmth. "Mom, this could sink Coraline's entire product line. We don't have 60 days to source an entirely new bee stock." "I understand that's difficult," I said calmly, But Coraline built an entire brand around a beeline your father spent over 30 years developing, then spent 2 years watching that history get quietly rewritten as her own personal discovery, right up until I learned I wasn't even properly acknowledged at the one ceremony honoring his actual life's work. I'm simply asking for that beeline to only be credited the way it was actually bred. There has to be another way to handle this that doesn't threaten her entire business. There is, I said, several in fact. She keeps using the bees, and the credit finally gets told accurately, starting immediately. Or she builds her brand around a different stock entirely, which she's welcome to do. I'm not interested in destroying what she's built. I'm interested in finally being an honest part of how that story gets told. Coraline called 2 days later, her voice sharp. Hazel, this is completely disproportionate. You're punishing me over how I frame press materials. No, I said quietly. I'm the woman who watched you spend 2 years quietly erasing where an entire beeline came from, right up until you turned my husband's life's work into a footnote at a ceremony organized specifically to showcase your own discovery story. I think the real question is what you thought would happen once I finally understood exactly how thoroughly that history was being erased. Every brand wants a clean discovery story. That's not a crime. It isn't, I agreed. But that beeline was never meant to fund a clean story in general. It was meant to carry a specific, real one. Those are different things, Coraline, and I think some part of you has always understood the difference, which is exactly why you kept softening the details every time someone asked. She hung up on me. I sat with the dial tone for a long moment, then went back out to the hives, understanding that whatever came next would take time to settle. The weeks that followed were difficult ones. Aldrich called nearly every day at first, caught between his wife's fury and a growing understanding of exactly what had actually been erased. Priscilla Okonkwo, the festival organizer, called Coraline directly to ask whether the acceptance speech she'd witnessed had actually been about her own mother-in-law, since word had traveled through the small regional beekeeping community about a licensing dispute. Coraline told me later that admitting the full truth to Priscilla out loud for the first time outside our immediate family had been strangely clarifying. Priscilla just said, "I noticed Hazel seemed quiet all night at that festival." Now I understand why, Coraline told me. I think I'd spent so long not letting myself notice it either that hearing someone else name it finally made it real. Rosalie, once she heard the whole story, offered to sit down with Aldrich directly, walking him through the full timeline the way only a sibling who'd grown up watching our parents work together could. She told me later that she'd laid out the whole sequence for him at his own kitchen table, using the same methodical precision she brought to grading a difficult lab report. Every incident dated and specific, watching her brother's face change as the pattern finally became undeniable. I don't think he understood how systematic it actually was until he saw it laid out chronologically, Rosalie told me. He kept saying, "I thought that was just one weird comment at one farmer's market." It wasn't one comment, Rosalie. It was 2 years of them. About a week after the letter went out, Aldrich asked if I'd be willing to join a video call with him and Coraline together, something he described a little awkwardly as trying to get everyone on the same page. I agreed, mostly out of curiosity about what that page might actually contain. When the call connected, Aldrich was sitting at their kitchen island, Coraline beside him, her expression carefully arranged into something between contrition and defensiveness. "Mom," Aldrich began, "we wanted to talk through everything as a family, figure out what happens next." "I'm listening," I said. Coraline spoke first, her voice tighter than I'd heard it before. "I think we all said things in the heat of the moment. I know the speech landed wrong, but sending a legal letter with no warning beyond what was legally required felt like it was designed to hurt my business as much as possible. Was that the intention?" I considered the question honestly before answering. The intention was to stop watching your father-in-law's actual legacy disappear a little more every month. If it hurt, I understand that. It should. 2 years of quiet erasure doesn't undo itself painlessly just because the reason it's ending is a fair one. "I could lose my entire product line if this becomes public before I'm ready," Coraline said, her composure cracking slightly. "Is that really what you wanted?" "What I wanted," I said, "was to stop being described as a personal discovery while your actual business funded itself entirely on your father-in-law's decades of patient breeding. I never once asked you to build a brand you couldn't tell honestly. I only asked eventually, and apparently not clearly enough, to be treated as an honest part of it. Aldrich was quiet for a long moment, and then he turned slightly toward Coraline, away from the camera, in a way that suggested he'd forgotten briefly that I could still see them both. "She's right," he said to her, quietly but clearly enough for me to hear. "We built an entire narrative around something that wasn't ours to simplify, and I let it happen because correcting it kept feeling like more trouble than it was worth." Caroline's eyes filled, and for the first time in the entire call, she didn't have a rebuttal ready. "I don't know how to fix a story that was built partly on someone else's silence," she said, almost to herself. "You start by no longer needing it to be a story at all," I told her. "Just an accurate description, plain as any breeding record in that apiary's own logbooks." "I'd like that," Aldrich said. "I've been waiting 2 years to hear it said plainly." The call ended a few minutes later, quieter than it began. About 3 weeks after the letter, Aldrich came to see me alone, sitting across from me at my own kitchen table. "Rosalie told me everything," he said, "the whole timeline laid out chronologically. I don't think I understood how systematic the erasure actually was until I saw it that way. I think I let myself believe it was harmless because correcting Coraline kept feeling like more effort than it was worth." He paused, looking out the window toward the hives themselves. "I keep thinking about the summers I spent out there with Dad," he said, handing him the smoker, just watching him work. "I don't know when I started forgetting how much of that gentleness actually belonged to him specifically." "Thank you for saying that now," I told him. "Why didn't you say something sooner, before it went on for 2 years?" "Because I kept telling myself it wasn't about credit," I said. "It was never about credit, Aldrich. It was about accuracy. About whether your father's actual life's work survived being used or quietly disappeared the moment it stopped being convenient to mention. Can I ask you something? Why did you let it go on for so long? You corrected people yourself early on. Why not every time after that?" "Because I kept believing the next occasion would finally be the one where the truth simply won out on its own," I admitted. "And because, if I'm honest, some part of me was afraid that correcting it too often would make me seem like a difficult mother-in-law rather than a supportive one. It took missing an entire ceremony honoring your father to understand how backward that priority actually was." Coraline came to see me on her own several weeks later, considerably more subdued than our phone call had been, sitting stiffly across from me at my own kitchen table. "I keep thinking about how close I came to actually losing my entire business," she admitted, before we'd even gotten to the harder parts of the conversation. "I know I have complicated feelings about how this happened, Hazel, but some part of this fear was just about genuinely believing I'd built something meaningful of my own. That's allowed to be true at the same time as everything else, right?" "Of course it is," I told her gently. "I never wanted you to lose what you'd built. I only ever wanted my husband's part in that story acknowledged honestly." She nodded, wiping her eyes, and continued. "I've been thinking about everything," she admitted, "about how easily the story became mine to control instead of something I was simply lucky enough to help continue. I think I was scared, honestly, that a beeline with a history that impressive would somehow make my own instincts look smaller by comparison, like I hadn't earned any of it myself. "You were never meant to compete with it, Coraline," I told her. "You were meant to help carry it forward honestly. Those are very different things." "I don't know how to undo 2 years of telling it wrong," she said. "You don't undo it," I told her. "You start telling it accurately, starting now, every single time it comes up, and let the story going forward finally be honest." "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Why did you keep giving me the benefit of the doubt for so long, even after that first magazine article, even after your own correction got laughed off at that farmer's market?" "Because I wanted so badly for you to be exactly who I hoped you were," I admitted. "It's a very particular kind of hope, watching your son fall in love with someone, hoping she'll turn out to be everything he sees in her. I think I let that hope talk me out of trusting my own instincts for longer than I should have." We talked for nearly 2 hours that afternoon about Gideon, about the apiary, about what that beeline had actually been bred to carry. I showed her Gideon's original breeding logs for the first time, over 30 years of careful handwritten notes about temperament, disease resistance, and honey quality, generation after generation. Coraline read through them slowly, her hands careful, before asking if she could have copies made for her own brand's archive, properly labeled this time. By the end of that conversation, something between us had shifted, not fully repaired, but genuinely, honestly begun. Aldrich and Coraline saw a counselor together that autumn, at Coraline's own insistence, something that had never happened in 4 years of marriage before that year. Coraline told me later that the counselor had asked them, in an early session, to describe the single biggest unspoken assumption underlying their partnership in the business. We both said the bees almost at the same time, Coraline said. Neither of us had ever said out loud how much of what we called my discovery actually depended on decades of breeding work that wasn't mine to claim as personal instinct. I called Prudence a few weeks after the letter went out to update her on how everything had actually unfolded, since the family reconciliation had moved faster than either of us expected. Hazel, I've drafted a lot of these licensing agreements over the years, she said, and I can tell you, what you did wasn't reckless. It was actually one of the more disciplined uses of a termination clause I've seen a client execute in 20 years of practice. I told her I hadn't thought of it in those terms, that it had felt in the moment more like an act of pure grief than discipline. Sometimes the two aren't as far apart as people assume, she said. You built that protection because you understood decades ago exactly how easily a breeding line story can slip away from its rightful breeders. The fact that you eventually needed it doesn't make you any less careful for having built it in the first place. Rosalie flew in for Thanksgiving that year, the first time in years that both of my children had gathered under one roof at once, my own dining room filled with the smell of a roast and the sound of easy conversation that hadn't existed at any family gathering in longer than I cared to admit. Aldrich and Coraline drove over with a pie Coraline had made herself, no professional styling, no staged photographs, just a slightly uneven crust. She laughed about setting down on my counter. Over dinner, Rosalie's own husband asked, innocently enough, how the whole bee situation had eventually settled, clearly having heard only fragments of the story secondhand. The table went quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that used to precede something painful in this family, before Coraline simply said, Hazel and Gideon bred that gentleness into those bees over 30 years, and I spent nearly 2 years letting a cleaner discovery story replace that history because the truth felt like it made my own instincts look less impressive somehow. She finally made me prove I could actually earn being part of that story honestly. Nobody laughed uncomfortably. Nobody needed the subject changed. Caroline called her own mother that same autumn, correcting at last the story she'd repeated so warmly at that holiday gathering months earlier. Aldrich told me she'd come off the phone looking wrung out, describing her mother's reaction as a long, uncomfortable silence followed by a quiet admission that she'd always privately wondered why a discovery that impressive had seemed to happen so quickly after she'd married into the family. She sent me a brief note not long after, considerably more restrained than Aldrich's or Coraline's own, but genuine in its own careful way, thanking me for correcting a picture of the beeline's history she'd simply accepted without ever asking directly. A few weeks after that Thanksgiving, a card arrived in my mailbox, Aldrich's familiar handwriting on the envelope. Inside, he'd written only a few lines. Mom, I keep thinking about all the months I let Coraline's version of the bees become the only version anyone heard. I can't undo that, but I can promise to correct the record every time it comes up again, out loud, without waiting for you to have to do it yourself. Thank you for finally showing all of us what Dad's actual work was worth. Tucked inside the same envelope was a smaller note in Coraline's own handwriting, brief and considerably more humble than anything she'd ever said to me directly. Hazel, I spent 2 years building a brand identity around a discovery that was never mine alone to claim. I'm sorry it took nearly losing my own business for me to understand that. I folded both notes carefully and placed them in a small drawer where I kept a photograph of Gideon standing proudly beside our very first dental colony decades earlier, grinning behind his veil at whoever was behind the camera. I think he would have recognized exactly what those notes meant, and I think he would have been quietly satisfied that the record eventually corrected itself. Coraline's product labels were reprinted within the month, corrected credits printed clearly, Gideon's and my names properly restored alongside a short note describing the Beeline's actual 35-year history. Coraline requested a new feature with the same regional artisan business magazine that had run the original Discovery story, this time providing the apiaries complete honest history for their materials. The publication, mildly surprised by an entrepreneur actively requesting a more complicated story than the one they'd already printed, agreed to run a corrected profile the following season, one that finally credited decades of careful breeding work rather than framing the beeline as a lucky personal find. Priscilla Okonkwo notably reached out to Coraline directly that winter, having heard through the small regional beekeeping community that the line's authorship had finally been disclosed honestly, and expressed renewed interest in featuring the apiary at the following year's festival, framing it now as a story about legacy and patient craft rather than solo discovery. I told her I appreciated the honesty this time around, Coraline told me. She said that was actually the whole reason she was willing to reconsider the invitation at all. The following year's festival program included a small dedicated section on the apiary's actual history, Gideon's photograph printed alongside a short paragraph describing 3 decades of careful breeding, exactly the acknowledgement that had been missing from the very first version. 3 months after the letter, once that honest history had genuinely taken root in how the family spoke about it, I reinstated the license under identical terms, requiring nothing further beyond what had always been agreed. Aldrich hugged me for a long time when I told him. I promise, he said, every single interview from now on starts with the real story. I saw Marguerite again that spring, over coffee at the same small cafe where we'd talked through everything the week after the festival. I told her about the reconciliation, the corrected labels, the honest feature. Marguerite listened with the same quiet satisfaction she'd shown from the very beginning. I told you it would matter holding that line, she said. Most people don't have the nerve to actually do it, even when they know they should. You did, and look what it actually bought you. Not just the license back, the truth back. I thought about that phrase for days afterward, the truth back, understanding that it described exactly what I'd been missing more than any royalty ever could have. Do you regret any of it? Marguerite asked gently. The 2 years of silence before you finally acted? I regret the silence, I told her. I don't regret the partnership, or the family, or even the patience I gave before finally reaching my limit. I think I needed all of it, in some strange way, to finally understand exactly what I was protecting when I insisted on that clause 2 years ago. I think about that phone call about the memorial recognition often, the Hive tool still resting in my hand, my son's careful voice explaining why my presence would complicate a clean story. At the moment, it felt like the end of something. Looking back now, I understand it was actually the beginning of something else entirely, a family finally required to reckon honestly with the legacy it had been quietly editing. I don't regret licensing that beeline freely. Aldrich's happiness mattered to me, and it still does. What I regret is how long I allowed my own husband's decades of patient work to be quietly rewritten before I finally insisted the record reflect reality. Real legacy was never meant to require its own history's erasure as the price of being properly appreciated, and I intend to make sure every story I'm actually part of survives being told accurately from now on. I think, too, about all the years I spent believing that quiet generosity was itself a kind of grace, that a good mother-in-law simply handed over whatever her children needed without ever asking the story to acknowledge the true cost. I no longer believe that. Giving without acknowledgement isn't grace, it's simply a slower, quieter kind of erosion, and it costs exactly as much in the end, whether you name it out loud or not. The difference is only in how long you wait to stop paying for it. I think about the specific moments now with a clarity I didn't have while I was living inside them. The magazine profile crediting Coraline's discovery. The customer told a story about handling technique that never happened. The festival program's single generic phrase standing in for 35 years of careful breeding. Each one seemed small enough to excuse in isolation. Strung together, they formed something considerably less innocent, a pattern deliberate enough that I no longer believe, looking back, that any of it was entirely accidental. Coraline may not have consciously planned each individual omission, but the cumulative effect served a purpose she understood on some level, even if she never named it to herself, keeping the beeline's real history small enough that the story could remain entirely, conveniently hers. Real generosity, I've come to believe, doesn't require secrecy to survive, and it certainly doesn't require humiliation as its price of admission. If a family needs you to disappear quietly into the background of your own husband's legacy in order to feel comfortable with their own narrative, that discomfort is telling you something important, and it deserves to be listened to, not smoothed over with another vague toast. I think of it now the way I used to think about a queen introduced too quickly into an unfamiliar hive. You can force that introduction if you want to. It rarely takes cleanly, and the whole colony feels the disruption for far longer than anyone bargained for, until someone finally slows down enough to let the truth settle properly. I think sometimes about all those years working the hives with Gideon, learning that every honest breeding decision depends on respecting exactly what a colony actually needs before you ever try to shape it into something else. It took me 74 years and one very public toast at my own daughter-in-law's harvest festival to apply that same standard to my own family. I licensed that beeline freely, and I would license it freely again. But I no longer accept a version of legacy that erases its own origin. If I am the reason a gentle strain exists at all, I intend to remain visibly part of that strain's story, not because I need applause, but because pretending otherwise was never generosity. It was only ever a kindness to someone else's more convenient narrative, purchased at the cost of my own husband's memory. The apiary celebrated its next harvest quietly the following year, family and close friends only, no press, no festival organizers, no rehearsed toast designed to impress anyone watching. Simple string lights and jars of honey finely labeled exactly the way they always should have been. Coraline gave a short, genuinely humble speech that evening, thanking her small staff, thanking Aldrich for his own growing role in the business, and then, without any hesitation or vague qualifier, thanking me and Gideon specifically for over 30 years of work that made any of tonight's success possible at all. She said our names clearly, our actual contributions stated plainly, no vague phrase standing in for the truth. Rosalie flew in specially for the occasion, standing near the back of the small crowd with genuine warmth on her face. Marguerite attended as my guest, finally getting to see the beeline properly credited the way it was always meant to be understood. I felt something settle in my chest that had been unsettled for 2 years. I am 74 years old, a widow, a retired beekeeper, a mother who still shows up for the people she loves whenever she's needed. But I am no longer a woman who quietly hands over her husband's life's work while watching its true origin get replaced by something more convenient. That particular version of me stayed behind in that beautifully lit festival tent, along with an untouched glass of wine and a toast about a discovery she made entirely on her own that nobody in that tent will ever quite forget. I drove home that night as one woman, and I woke up the next morning as another, and I have never once wished myself back into the first one. Sometimes people ask me if I'd do anything differently, if given the chance to go back to the day Aldrich first told me about Coraline's plans, knowing everything I know now. I tell them the truth. I would license that beeline again, every single time, because Aldrich's happiness was never the mistake. The mistake was assuming a good breeding line would naturally protect its own history, that 35 years of careful selection could survive on its own weight without anyone occasionally insisting the actual breeders be acknowledged. If I could change one thing, it wouldn't be the license I gave. It would be the 2 years of small corrections I let slide, corrections I mistook again and again for graciousness rather than what they actually were. A slow and quiet surrender of my own husband's memory. Rosalie's own students ask me sometimes, whenever she brings me in as a guest speaker for her biology classes, to tell them the whole story of how our particular beeline actually came to exist. I tell it every single time exactly the same way, unhurried and complete. That first unusually calm colony, decades of careful pairing decisions, Gideon's own patient handwriting filling logbook after logbook, watching them absorb a history that finally belongs to everyone who actually helped build it. No detail softened, no name left out, exactly the way it should have been told from the very beginning. These days, when anyone asks about the bees behind that apiary's honey, they hear the whole story, that first calm colony, the decades of patient breeding, a marriage folded into 35 years of careful, quiet work. I'm simply finally exactly as present in that history as I always should have been.